She held the breaking world on her shoulder, the great heartwood beam of the barn groaning like a dying beast against her spine. If this story moves you, do me a kindness before we go any further. Subscribe to the channel, follow it all the way to the end, because the part that will stay with you comes late, and leave the name of your town down in the comments so we can all watch together how far this story travels. Now let me carry you back to where it truly began. She had walked for 3 days. The road was alkali dust and indifference, and it coated the hem of her dark poplin dress and settled in the lines of her face. Her name was Melin, and she carried all she owned in a single cloth-wrapped bundle. She was a woman built on a scale the world was not prepared for. Her hands were large, her shoulders broad, her body a fortress of soft, solid flesh. She was a fat Chinese woman in a land of sharp edges and pale, narrow people. She had learned early that her body was a provocation. Her bigness, her color, her too muchness. It was a sin she was born into, a crime for which she was always on trial. In the city, men had looked at her with a mix of curiosity and contempt, as if she were a piece of exotic livestock they could not quite price. Women had looked at her with pity or with fear, their whispers like the scrape of dry leaves. She had learned to build a wall behind her eyes. She had learned to wear a still face, a placid mask that betrayed nothing, that asked for nothing, that expected nothing. It was armor, forged in 1,000 tiny rejections, and it had served her well. It kept the hurt out. Mostly. She had learned other things too. She had learned the language of silence, the language of wood, how it spoke of its stresses in whispers of grain and cracks thin as thread. She had learned the language of stone, how it settled and shifted with the turning of seasons. She had learned the language of numbers in a ledger, how they could lie with perfect neatness or sing a song of ruin. She was a fortress, yes, but a fortress with a keen and watchful guard in the tower. The place she came to was called Thorn's Claim. It was not a claim so much as a slow surrender. The sign hung from one hinge, and the gate beneath it sagged. She stopped before it, and her eyes, the only part of her that was not still, began to read the story of the land. The land talked, and Maylene knew the language. It spoke of neglect born of sorrow. The fence posts were rotted at their base, a slow decay that started in the earth and worked its way up. The fields were patchy, the soil showing the white ghost of alkali poison where the irrigation ditches had been allowed to clog and fail. The main house, a 2-story timber frame, had a weary list to the west, as if it were tired of standing and wished only to lie down. It was a place hollowed out by loss, and the emptiness echoed in the rattling of the loose window frames. A man came out onto the porch. He moved like the house looked, leaning into a wind that wasn't there. He was tall and spare, his face a map of exhaustion. Grief had pared him down to bone and quiet desperation. He watched her approach, his eyes holding no welcome, only a deep, settled weariness. This was Elias Thorne. Melin stopped a respectful distance from the porch steps. She did not offer a name or a purpose. She waited. That was another thing she had learned. The world was quick to fill a silence, and what it said often revealed more than any question could. "Looking for work?" he asked. His voice was rough, like dry soil. Maylene gave a single, slow nod. "I ain't got much to offer," he said, his gaze sweeping over his own failing property. "Barely enough for me and the girl. And Jed." Maylene's eyes went to the foundation of the house. She saw it clear as day. The main sill plate, the great timber that held the whole western wall, was punky with rot where the gutter had failed years ago. Water had dripped and dripped, a patient assassin, and now the wood was soft as bread. The entire house was resting on a lie. She pointed with her chin, a small, economical movement. "Your main sill is gone," she said. Her voice was low and calm, a statement of fact, not an accusation. "The whole west wall is sitting on rot. A strong wind comes through, it'll fold." Elias Thorne went still. He followed her gaze, squinting. He had looked at that house every day of his life and had never truly seen it. He had seen the memory of his wife arranging flowers in the window. He had seen the ghost of his daughter playing on the steps. But he had not seen the slow, patient death of its bones. He walked down the steps and crouched, running a hand along the timber she had indicated. His fingers sank into the wood. He pulled back a handful of damp, fibrous decay. He stood up slowly, wiping his hand on his trousers. He looked at her then, really looked at her. He saw her bigness, her plain dress, her foreign face. But he had also heard her words, and they rang with the clear, hard sound of truth. He was a carpenter by trade, or had been, before the grief had taken the tools from his hands. He knew she was right. "Say that again," he said, not in disbelief, but in a kind of dawning wonder. "The sill plate is rotted through," Malin repeated, her face as still as ever. "You'll need to jack the wall, cut out the rot, and splice in a new timber, a long one, and you'll need to fix the gutter first." He stared at her for a long moment, at the quiet competence that radiated from her, like heat from a stone. He was a drowning man, and she had just pointed out that the bottom was not as far as he thought. "I can pay you in board," he said, "and $1 a week." Malin nodded once. The bargain was struck. The armor had not come loose, not even a single plate, but she had a place to stand and work to do. And for now, that was enough. The work began the next morning. Elias showed her the tool shed, a place of dust and orderless grief. Tools lay where they had been dropped months, maybe years ago, their edges filmed with rust. Malin said nothing. She took up a whetstone and a can of oil and began the slow, meditative work of bringing the steel back to life. She sharpened saws and chisels, planes and draw knives, her hands moving with an unhurried, rhythmic grace. When the tools were sharp enough to shave with, she went to the woods behind the house. She walked among the tall pines, her hand resting on their trunks, reading their grain, their age, their strength. She chose a tall, straight fir, one that had grown slow and dense in the shade of its brothers. She felled it herself with a two-man saw, the blade singing its steady song through the wood. She squared it with a broadex, the chips flying, her movements powerful and precise. Elias watched her. He had intended to help, but found himself a spectator. He had never seen a woman, any woman, wield an axe with such authority. She was not just strong, she was skilled. She understood the wood, where to cut, how to use the weight of the axe head to do the work. He felt a flicker of something he had not felt in years, a quiet professional respect. She built the cribbing and the jacks herself, using leverage and a deep understanding of physics to move timbers he would have struggled with. She slowly, carefully lifted the entire western wall of his house a quarter of an inch off its foundation. The house groaned in protest, but it held. With the wall supported, she began the surgical work of cutting out the rot. It was a bigger job than even she had guessed. The decay had spread into the floor joists and the wall studs. She cut it all away, leaving only clean, solid wood. While she worked, a small shadow watched her from the corner of the porch. This was Sarah, Elias's daughter. She was a child made of silence, her eyes too big and too old for her small face. Her mother's death had stolen her voice. She watched Malin with a wary, unblinking intensity. Malin never tried to speak to her. She never offered a bright, false smile. She knew that a wounded creature had to come to you in its own time. So she simply acknowledged the child's presence. As she worked, she would hum, low and tuneless, a sound like a bumblebee in a jar. When she ate her midday meal, a simple bowl of rice and greens, she would leave a small, perfectly peeled apple on the porch railing and then turn her back. The apple was always gone when she looked again. One afternoon, Malin was wrestling a new joist into place. She needed a shim, a small wedge of wood to make it sit perfectly level. She had left her shim box just out of reach. Before she could move, a small hand appeared beside her, holding out the exact piece of wood she needed. Malin took it without a word, tapped it into place, and checked the level. It was perfect. She looked at Sarah, who stood watching her, her expression solemn. Malin gave a small, slow nod of thanks. The girl did not smile, but she did not run away. A bridge had been built, small and fragile, but it was there. There was another watcher, too, a man with one arm and a face like a dried creek bed. This was Jedediah, the old ranch hand who had stayed on out of loyalty or inertia. He had made no secret of his disdain for a woman, a Chinese woman, doing a man's work. He would stand with his arms crossed, his one arm crossed over the stump of the other, and spit tobacco juice near her feet. Milan ignored him. She knew his kind of pride. It was brittle, and arguing with it only made it stronger. It had to be shown, not told. The moment came with a sick mare. The horse was down in the paddock, its breath coming in ragged gasps. Jed stood over it, his face grim. "Colic," he pronounced. "Nothing for it. She's a goner." Milan came and stood beside him. She looked at the mare, not with pity, but with that same intense diagnostic gaze she had used on the house. She saw the sweat on the horse's coat, the faint yellowing in its eyes, the way it kicked at its own swollen belly. "It's not colic," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It's a twisted gut. She must have rolled." Jed snorted. "And what would you know about it?" Maylene did not answer him. She went to the house and came back with a bottle of laudanum from the medicine chest and a long leather rein. She coaxed the horse to drink a little of the medicine mixed with water, her voice a low murmur. Then she began to walk the mare. Round and round the paddock they went, Maylene's hand firm on the rein, her presence a great, solid mountain of calm. She walked for hours. As dusk fell, the mare, exhausted but past the crisis, finally lowered her head and began to graze. The swelling in her belly had gone down. Jedediah had watched the entire time. He walked over to where Malin stood stroking the horse's neck. He looked at her, then at the horse, then back at her. He cleared his throat. "Much obliged," he grunted. It was as close to an apology as he was capable of giving. From that day on, he stopped spitting near her feet. He began to leave a bucket of fresh water where she was working, and once he even sharpened her axe for her. A second bridge had been built. Life settled into a rhythm. The house became sound and true on its new foundation. The fields were cleared of alkali, the ditches dug deep and straight. The fences were mended. Under Maylene's steady hand, the slow surrender of Thorne's claim began to turn into a quiet, determined stand. Then one Tuesday, a fine black buggy rolled up the lane, pulled by a pair of matched gray horses. A man climbed down. He was a man made of soft curves and expensive wool. His belly was round, his face was plump, and he wore a smile that looked as if it had been set there with a trowel and left to dry. This was Mr. Silas Blackwood, the owner of the town bank and a pillar of the church. Elias came out to meet him, a flicker of old deference in his posture. "Mr. Blackwood," he said. "Elias, my boy," Blackwood boomed, his voice as round and soft as his body. "Just checking in, seeing how you and the little one are faring." His eyes slid past Elias and landed on Maylene, who was resetting a loose stone in the porch steps. He took in her size, her plain clothes, her foreignness. His smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "I see you found some help," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. He looked Maylin up and down as if she were a mule at auction. "A sturdy specimen, Thorne. Good for heavy work, I imagine." Maylin did not look up. She did not flinch. But inside her fortress, a gate slammed shut and a bar dropped into place. She had heard that tone her entire life. It was the sound of being dismissed, of being rendered an object. The old armor held, but the insult was noted and filed away. Elias, lost in his own troubles, missed the poison in the words. "This is Maylin," he said. "She's been a great help." Blackwood clapped Elias on the shoulder. "Good, good. A man needs help. Now about that note, my boy, it's coming due." They went inside. Maylin continued her work, fitting the stone into its bed of mortar. Her hands were steady, but her mind was working. She had seen men like Blackwood before. Men who used kindness as a weapon and piety as a shield. Men whose smiles were a warning. That night, the quiet desperation was back in Elias's face. He sat at the kitchen table, a stack of papers and a ledger before him, his head in his hands. He could not make the numbers make sense. They swam before his eyes, a testament to his failure. Maylin finished washing the dishes and came to the table. She stood for a moment in silence, then reached out a hand. "Let me," she said. It was not a question. Elias looked up, surprised. He saw no judgment in her still face, only a quiet capability. He slid the ledger across the table. For most, the ledger was a book of numbers. For Maylin, it was a story. She began to read. Her finger traced the columns of figures, the spidery handwriting, the dates. The land talked, the wood talked, and the numbers, they screamed. She worked late into the night. the only light from a single kerosene lamp. She saw it all. The original loan, taken out when Elias's wife was sick. The interest rate, fair at first, then creeping upwards. She saw promissory notes with ballooning payments, fees for services never rendered, charges for seed that was never delivered. It was a masterpiece of patient, predatory greed. Mr. Silas Blackwood wasn't a friend helping a grieving neighbor. He was a spider, and Elias was the fly, already half wrapped in silk. The final goal was clear in the land grants attached to the loan. Blackwood wasn't after the farm. He was after the water rights to the creek that ran through it, the only reliable water source for miles. She closed the ledger. The house was silent around her. She felt no anger, only a cold, hard certainty. This was the way of men like Blackwood. They fed on weakness and called it business. They devoured the grieving and called it providence. She had built her armor against a world of casual cruelty, but this was something else. This was methodical, calculated evil hiding behind a soft body and a trowel smile. The next morning, she laid it all out for him. She put the ledger on the table and opened it. She did not use emotional words, she used facts. She pointed to the dates, the interest calculations, the hidden clauses in the loan agreements. "He's been bleeding you since your wife took sick," she said calmly. "Every time you were at your weakest, he added another charge, another fee. He means to take the land, Elias, not for the farm, for the water." Elias stared at the pages, but his eyes were clouded with memory. He shook his head, a gesture of denial. "No," he said, his voice thick. "Mr. Blackwood, he paid for the doctor. He brought food to the house when she was fading. He prayed with me." "He was buying your trust," Maylene said, her voice still level. "The cost of a doctor is very little when you mean to steal a man's whole future. Look at the dates. The day after your wife was buried, the interest on the main loan doubled. He called it a risk adjustment." The words hung in the air. Elias looked from the ledger to Maylene's face. He saw no malice there, no triumph. He saw only the unsparing truth. He had been blind, willfully blind, because it was easier to believe in a friend's kindness than a predator's patience. He looked at this large, quiet woman who had mended his house, soothed his child, and healed his stock. She had never offered a single false word of comfort. She offered only what was real, what was true. He had hired a helper. He had found a protector. He put his hand over hers on the open ledger. It was the first time he had touched her by choice. "All right, Maylin," he said, and in the saying of her name, a partnership was forged. The quiet war had begun. The war came not with papers and lawyers, but with water. The spring rains that year were biblical. For a week, the sky was a gray canvas of weeping cloud, and the creek began to swell. It turned from a placid ribbon of blue to a churning brown monster, eating at its banks, carrying logs and debris in its maw. The new foal barn, built on what had always been high ground, was suddenly in peril. The water rose with terrifying speed. By evening, it was lapping at the barn's foundation. The main gate to the paddock, the one that held the mares and their new foals, began to groan under the pressure of the current. A large log slammed into it, and with a crack like a gunshot, one of the hinges tore loose. The gate sagged, threatening to give way completely and release the terrified animals into the raging floodwaters. Elias and Jed fought to secure it, but the force of the water was too much. It pushed them back, relentless and powerful. "It's no good," Jed yelled over the roar of the creek. "She's gonna go." Maylene appeared beside them, her face grim in the lantern light. She did not waste time with ropes. She simply waded into the thigh-deep, freezing current. She put her back against the failing gate and her feet against the slick mud of the creek bed, and she pushed. She became a part of the landscape, a bulwark against the flood. Her bigness, her solidity, the quality the world had always mocked as too much, was now the only thing standing between the foals and certain death. The water shoved and tore at her, but she did not yield. Her muscles screamed. The cold leached the strength from her bones, but she held her ground. Her face was no longer still. It was a mask of pure, primal effort. Seeing her, Elias and Jed found a new reserve of strength. They worked frantically, leveraging posts against the gate, hammering braces into the muddy bank. For 10 minutes that felt like an eternity, Maylene held the flood at bay. Finally, with a last desperate effort, they secured the gate. It was ugly, but it was holding. Malin stumbled back out of the water, shivering uncontrollably, her clothes soaked, her legs caked in mud. She leaned against the barn wall, gasping for breath. The crisis was over. The foals were safe. Elias came to her. He was also soaked and exhausted, his face streaked with mud. He looked at her, at the sheer, indomitable strength she had just displayed. He was a man of few words, and now he had none at all. He reached out and put a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of profound gratitude. Then, overwhelmed, he pulled her into a brief, hard embrace. He held her for only a second, his arms tight around her broad back. "You saved them," he whispered into her wet hair. "Maylene, you saved them." It was not a lover's embrace. It was the embrace of a comrade, of a man whose all was too big for words. But for Maylene, it was a cataclysm. No one had held her like that in her entire life. Not with gratitude, not with respect. The touch was a crack in the armor, a place where the warmth got in. When he let go, she stood very still, feeling the ghost of his arms around her as the floodwaters began, slowly, to recede. Silas Blackwood learned of his thwarted foreclosure. He could not attack Elias Thorne directly, not while the man had such a capable ally. So he shifted his tactics. He could not break Malin's body, so he decided to break her name. The rumors started as whispers in the general store, as murmurs over the church pews. They spread like fire through dry grass. An unmarried woman, a foreigner, a heathen, living in a widower's house. It was unseemly. It was a disgrace. Her competence was twisted into a lust for control, her quietness into cunning, her strength into something unnatural, almost masculine. Blackwood fanned the flames with pious concern, shaking his head sadly over Thorne's poor judgment and the bad influence on the motherless child. The whispers found their champion in Martha Gable. She was the wife of the town councilman and the undisputed leader of its decent women. Martha was a woman wounded by righteousness. Years ago, she had lost her only son to a fever, and her grief had calcified into a rigid, unbending moral code. She saw sin everywhere, a threat to the fragile order of her world. The stories about the woman at Thorne's claim offended her deeply. She saw it as her Christian duty to intervene. She arrived at the farm one afternoon, her back ramrod straight, her face set in a mask of grim purpose. She found Malin in the vegetable garden, weeding a row of carrots, her hands deep in the dark, rich soil. Sarah was beside her, meticulously pulling up the smaller weeds. "I have come to speak with you," Martha Gable announced, her voice tight and cold. Malin rose slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at the woman and saw past the bombazine dress and the rigid posture. She saw the deep, permanent ache in her eyes. It was the same hollowed-out look she had seen in Elias, the look of someone who has buried a part of their own soul. "It is not right," Martha began, her voice gaining strength, "for you to be here, a woman of your kind, in this house, with that poor, motherless child. It is a stain on this community. People are talking." Maylene did not defend herself. She did not argue. She simply listened, her face still, her eyes holding Martha's. When the woman finally ran out of accusations, the garden was quiet save for the buzzing of bees. "You lost a child," Maylene said. It was not a question. Her voice was incredibly soft. Martha Gable flinched as if struck. "What does that have to do with anything?" she snapped, her composure cracking. "I know the shape of that emptiness," Malin continued, her gaze unwavering. "My mother lost 2 sons before me. She carried that silence in her hands for the rest of her life. Sometimes the only way to make the world feel solid again is to build strong walls, strong rules, to keep the chaos out." She had not raised her voice, she had not accused. She had simply held up a mirror, and in it, Martha Gable saw her own grief-stricken heart. The righteous anger drained out of her, leaving her looking tired and fragile. She had come expecting a fight, a denial, a shouting match. She had not expected to be understood. She stared at Maylene, at this impossible woman who could read rot in timber and sorrow in a stranger's eyes. The rumors, the whispers, they suddenly seemed small and ugly. She turned without another word and walked back to her buggy, her back no longer quite so straight. The attack had been met not with a shield, but with an open hand, and it had been utterly disarmed. But Blackwood's trap was already sprung. The final note was due, and he refused any extension. The foreclosure was inevitable. He orchestrated the final act to be a public spectacle, a lesson to any who might defy him. He posted the notice on the door of his own bank. The auction of Thorne's claim to be held on the steps that Saturday. The whole town gathered. It was a somber affair, a public execution of one of their own. Elias Thorne stood beside Malin, his face pale but resolute. Sarah clung to Malin's hand. Jedediah stood behind them, his one good arm crossed, his expression thunderous. Mr. Silas Blackwood mounted the steps, his soft body exuding a false air of sorrow. He held up a hand for silence. "My friends," he began, his voice oozing sympathy, "it is with a heavy heart that I stand before you today. Our friend Elias Thorne has fallen on hard times. Despite my every effort to aid him, to guide him with Christian charity, he has failed to meet his obligations. The bank, as a servant of this community's prosperity, must now do its duty." He was about to declare the auction open when Malin moved. She walked to the bottom of the steps, the heavy ledger held in her hands. She did not look at Blackwood. She looked at the faces in the crowd. "Mr. Blackwood speaks of duty," she said, her voice clear and calm, carrying easily in the silent square. "Let us look at his duties as written in his own book." She opened the ledger, and she began to read. She read the entry for the first loan and the date it was given, the day Elias's wife received her terminal diagnosis. She read the entry for the first interest hike and the date it was enacted, the day of the funeral. She read the list of charges for seed that was never delivered, for fence wire that was never strung. Her voice was a monotone, a simple recitation of facts, but the story it told was one of monstrous cruelty. She laid out the entire fraudulent scheme, line by line, date by date. The crowd was utterly still, captivated. Blackwood's trowel smile began to slip. "These are private matter," he blustered. "This is highly improper." Malin ignored him. She turned a page. "And here," she said, her voice dropping slightly, "is the grant application Mr. Blackwood filed with the territorial government for exclusive water rights to Thorns Creek. An application he filed 6 months ago, confident that this day would come." A collective gasp went through the crowd. They all understood. This was not about a debt. This was about water. This was about theft on a grand scale. The smile fell from Blackwood's face completely, like a mask of plaster shattering on the ground. His face, naked now, was ugly with rage and humiliation. "You have no right," he snarled, his voice a venomous hiss. You yellow cow, get away from my bank." The slur, raw and vicious, hung in the air. And in that moment, everyone saw him for what he was. Before anyone else could react, a new voice rang out. "She speaks the truth." Martha Gable pushed her way to the front of the crowd. She stood beside Malin, facing Blackwood. "I have seen this woman's heart," she declared, her voice ringing with the conviction of the newly converted. "And I have seen yours, Silas Blackwood. You are a viper in our midst." That broke the spell. Jedediah stepped forward, then the blacksmith, then a dozen others. The townspeople who had come to witness a foreclosure now formed a protective wall around Malin and Elias. They turned their backs on the man on the steps, their judgment a silent, crushing weight. Silas Blackwood was ruined. His power, built on a foundation of lies and false piety, had crumbled to dust under the weight of a quiet woman and a simple book of numbers. A year passed. The seasons turned, and Thorne's claim was transformed. It was no longer a place of sorrow and surrender. It was a showplace, a hidden gem. The house was painted a clean, bright white. The fields were green and lush, the irrigation ditches running full and clear. The fences were straight and strong. It was a place made whole, a testament to hard work and quiet competence. Malin was the undisputed heart of it all. She moved through the days with a sense of purpose that was deep and settled. The still face was still her habit, but the wall behind her eyes had come down. She was no longer a fortress, she was a harbor. Sarah was her constant shadow, a chattering, laughing girl whose voice had returned, full of stories and questions. Jedediah took her word as gospel, deferring to her judgment on everything from horseflesh to weather. And Martha Gable was a frequent visitor, bringing pies and town news, their friendship a strange and sturdy thing, built on a moment of shared, unexpected grace. One evening in late summer, Malin and Elias sat on the porch they had rebuilt together. The sun was setting, casting a long gold light over the fields they had saved. The air was warm and smelled of cut hay and contentment. For a long time they sat in a comfortable silence, the silence of people who no longer needed words to understand one another. Then Elias spoke, his voice low and earnest in the twilight. "When you first came here," he began, I just thought I was hiring a helper, someone to do the heavy work I no longer had the heart for." He turned to look at her, and his eyes were full of a gentle wonder. "I saw a big, strong woman. I didn't see the rest. I didn't see the way you see things, the truth of them. You saw the rot in the house. You saw the poison in the ledger. You saw the sickness in the mare. You even saw the grief in Martha Gable." He shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. "Everyone else in the world, they looked at you and saw too much. Too big, too strong, too plain. They were wrong. Your bigness held up my roof. Your strength held back a flood. Your stubbornness, your refusal to be beaten. It saved my home. It saved my daughter. Malin, your too muchness was just enough to save us." He reached over and took her hand. His was calloused and warm. "I don't want to help her anymore," he said softly. "And I don't want to be your boss. I want a partner. I want your name next to mine on the deed to this place. Not because you've earned it, though you have, 100 times over. But because this place is as much you as it is me, I'm asking you to stay. Not because we need you, but because we choose you." Malin looked at their joined hands in the fading golden light. She felt something shift deep inside her, a seismic crack in the foundation of her soul. The armor, the heavy, cumbersome armor she had carried since she was a girl, the weight of 1,000 slights and 1,000,000 whispers, it simply fell away. It did not shatter. It turned to dust and blew away on the evening breeze, leaving her open and vulnerable and whole for the first time in her life. The hurt of a lifetime was gone, replaced by a quiet, overwhelming peace. She had been seen. She had been known. She was home. She lifted her head and looked at him, at this good, quiet man who had finally learned to see. Her still face broke, and for the first time, he saw the true, beautiful smile she had kept hidden from the world. Yes,